Thomas, a widower farmer, was warned. Every man who courted the orc Mara died. 8 suitors, 8 accidents, 0 survivors. No man survives marrying that orc, they said. He smiled and replied, "Then I'll be the first." He didn't know the accidents were murders. He didn't know a jealous farmer had been killing his rivals for years. He only knew he was done being alone. Tomas was a man who had already buried one love, and saw no reason to fear death. Mara was an orc who had never known love, only a string of funerals she didn't cause but carried anyway. Their meeting was not chance, it was a choice. Against every warning, Thomas walked into her life, and the valley waited for him to become accident number 9. But Thomas didn't believe in curses. He believed in what he could see: a woman exiled by superstition, and a pattern of deaths too convenient to be fate. The question no one dared ask: was the curse real, or was someone making sure it looked that way? The Thornwood Valley had lived under a ghost for 7 years. Not a spirit you could see, but one you could count. 8 men, all suitors to the same orc woman, all dead in ways the valley called accidents. Rope snaps on a cliff climb, a sudden rock slide on a quiet trail, a wagon wheel flying loose at full speed, a drowning in 3 feet of water. None of the deaths looked connected, except for one detail. Every man had asked Mara to marry him, and every man had been buried within a month. Mara herself was a blacksmith, not by trade, but by necessity. She lived at the edge of the valley, where the pines grew thick and the soil turned sour, because the village had pushed her there after the 3rd death. She was broad-shouldered, green-skinned, with tusks she filed down to seem less threatening, though that only made people whisper more. She had not asked for courtship. She had not encouraged the men. But she had not refused them either, because refusing meant accepting that the curse was her fault. And she did not believe in curses. She believed in loneliness, which was a different kind of death, slower and quieter. Tomas knew the feeling. He had buried his wife Ilara 4 winters ago, not to violence, but to a wasting sickness that took her voice first, then her hands, then everything. He had kept the farm running, but only just. The fields were patchy, the barn leaned, and the fence line was held together by habit. He had stopped talking much. He had stopped noticing the weather. He had entered a long gray pause. And then he saw Mara. It was market day in Stillwater, the valley's central trade post. She was loading iron ingots onto a cart, alone, while a circle of empty space moved with her like she wore a warning bell. Thomas watched a man step aside rather than share a doorway. He watched a mother pull a child back by the collar. And he watched Mara's face. Not sad, not angry, but something worse. Accustomed. She had stopped expecting anything else. That expression hooked him more than any beauty could. He recognized it. He had worn it himself. He walked across the empty circle, introduced himself, and offered to help with the ingots. She looked at him like he had just spoken a foreign language. Then she said, "You're new here." He wasn't new. He had lived in Thornwood his whole life, just invisible, up on the Ridge farm. She meant new to the circle of men who didn't run. "No," he said. "I'm just not afraid of ghosts." That was the first conversation of a courtship that would set the entire valley on edge. Word spread within a day. Old Man Ferrick, who owned the adjoining spread and spoke for the valley's landowners, rode up to Tomas's farm unannounced. Ferrick was nearly 70, built like a bull that had been fed on spite, and wealthy enough that his opinion carried the weight of law. "You're making a mistake," he said, not bothering to dismount. 8 men made that mistake. You want to be number 9? Tomas leaned on his shovel. I want to know if it's really a curse. Ferrick's face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a tightening, quick and gone. You'll find out, he said. Then he turned his horse and left. Tomas watched him ride off and felt the first cold thread of suspicion. Not of Mara, of how quickly the warning had arrived, and from whom. He began courting her openly. He walked to her forge in the evenings, bringing bread or a joint of smoked meat. They talked while she worked. He learned she had been born in the valley to an orc mother and a human father, both dead now. She had lived here all her life, had once been tolerated, if not welcomed, until the first suitor fell from Hawk's Ledge, and the valley needed a reason why. A half-breed orc with a blacksmith's strength made an easy story. He asked about the other suitors. She could name them all. Jareth the woodcutter, drowned. Mikkel the trapper, crushed by a deadfall. Alden the tailor, trampled by his own horse. She kept a small list, written on scrap leather because no one else had ever asked for the names. 3 weeks into the courtship, the first accident came for Tomas. He was repairing the barn roof, hammering shingles, when the main support beam beneath him cracked and the entire north corner collapsed. He fell 15 feet and landed hard, but a pile of hay bales, newly stacked, not by him, broke the drop. When he dug himself out, bruised but alive, he inspected the beam. The break was not splintered like fresh wood snapping under load. The outer edges were smooth, cut partway through with a saw, then covered with dirt to hide the incision. Someone had climbed onto his property, selected the exact beam that would bring down the most weight, and sabotaged it. Someone who knew barn construction. He did not tell the sheriff. There was no sheriff in the valley. Only Ferrick's word and a collective agreement not to pry too hard. He told Mara. She went pale, not with surprise, but with recognition. Jareth's boat, she said. It had a hole drilled in the hull. I found the plug on the shore. No one believed me. Tomas asked if she had kept the plug. She had. A carved dowel, she said, with marks from a lathe. Marks she could match to a specific workshop if she had the tool that made them. That was the moment the gray void of Tomas's grief began to sharpen into something else. Not just love, not just defiance. A hunt. The second attempt came 10 days later. He was riding back from the high pasture when his horse, a steady mare named Cinder, suddenly reared and bolted toward a ravine. He jumped free at the last instant, rolling through thorns, while Cinder stopped 20 paces short of the cliff, trembling and foaming. When he calmed her and retraced the path, he found a rag tied to a bush, soaked in ashroot extract, a scent that sent horses into panic. The rag was linen, high quality, the kind a wealthy man might use for handkerchiefs. Not a farmer's scrap. Tomas pocketed it. He now had a saw-cut beam, a witness to a drilled boat hull from years ago, and a linen rag. Small pieces, but they pointed in one direction. The 8 suitors weren't cursed. They were murdered, and the man who had killed them was still here. And now, Tomas was in his way. He looked across the darkening valley toward Ferrick's estate, where lamplight glowed in the windows. He thought about the man's offhand warning, the flicker in his eyes, and the wealth that allowed him to own the valley's only lathe-equipped workshop. And then he thought about Mara, alone in her forge, waiting to hear if he had become accident number 9. He was still alive. That meant the killer would have to try again, and this time, Tomas would be ready. Tomas did not wait for the next attack. He went back to Mara's forge that same night, walking the dark path with a lantern and a hand on his belt knife. She was still at the anvil, working iron by the orange glow of the coals. He placed the cut beam fragment, the ash root rag, and a sketch of the barn's sabotage on her work table. Then she brought out the boat plug. It was a wooden dowel, 2 inches long, dark with age, one end carved into a precise taper. The other end showed clear lathe marks, spiral grooves, left by a rotating blade. "Same workshop," he said. "Your beam and this plug were cut by the same tool. I've seen that lathe before." Mara's eyes, deep amber, fixed on him. "Where?" "Ferrick's workshop," he said. "He's the only man in the valley who owns a foot-powered lathe with a curved chisel. I helped him repair it 2 winters ago, when he still bothered with neighborly help. The blade leaves a double-line pattern. It's here, and it's here." Mara did not ask if he was certain. She pressed her forehead against his for 3 long seconds, then pulled back and opened a drawer beneath the anvil. Inside was a bundle of scrap leather, the list of 8 suitors, each with a note in her careful, spiky hand. "Then they all belong to him," she said. She spread the leather pieces across the table. Jareth, the woodcutter, drowned. The boat plug was his death. Mikkel, the trapper, crushed by a deadfall trap. Alden, the tailor, trampled. Rope snapped on a cliff for Loran. Rock slide for Evard. Wagon wheel for Perrin. Barn collapse for Garin, a man Thomas had known, who had been found under a pile of hay with a broken neck. 8 deaths, and now clues connecting each one to the valley's wealthiest landowner. But Thomas knew that a pattern wasn't proof. He needed testimony, documentation, something that would convince people who had accepted the curse for 7 years. He began visiting the families. The first was Jareth's widow, a woman named Leon, who kept a dry goods stall in Stillwater. She was the only one who had ever doubted the curse. When Thomas sat in her small kitchen and showed her the boat plug, her face broke open, not with grief, but with the specific release of a person finally believed. "Jareth wrote me a letter," she said, 3 days before he died. "I didn't show anyone because it seemed paranoid." She brought out a folded paper, yellowed with age. Jareth had written that Ferrick had offered him a large sum to leave the valley and forget Mara. He had refused. The letter ended. "If something happens to me, it will be that man's doing. Look to the boat." The letter had been sitting in a box for 6 years. Silent proof no one had asked for. Tomas went next to Mikkel's brother, Davin, a fur trader who lived at the valley's northern pass. Davin was a hard man, quick to anger, but he listened when Thomas described the lathe marks. He brought out Mikkel's trapping journal. The entries for the 2 weeks before his death documented a dispute. Ferrick had been setting his own traps on Mikkel's licensed line, and Mikkel had confronted him. The last entry read, "Ferrick said I'd regret crossing him. Later, a deadfall trap I didn't set snapped my leg. I got free, barely. He's warning me." 3 days later, Mikkel was found crushed under the largest deadfall in his path. No one had bothered to read the journal. A pattern was crystallizing. Ferrick didn't just kill suitors randomly. He identified each man's routine, studied their vulnerabilities, then engineered an accident that looked like their own bad luck. He was a methodical predator, using his wealth and knowledge of the valley to eliminate anyone who threatened his claim. And his claim, Thomas now realized, wasn't land or money. It was Mara. Ferrick had asked for her hand 7 years ago, before the first suitor died. She had refused him. Not gently, she had thrown a hammer at his head and told him he was a coward who bought what he couldn't earn. That refusal had seeded an obsession. He couldn't have her, so he made sure no one else would. The third attempt on Thomas came while he was still gathering statements. Ferrick sent 2 hired men, brothers from a neighboring county, who had been paid to torch his barn while he slept. Thomas had expected something like this. He had moved his few animals to a hillside pen, and now slept in the barn loft himself, on a pallet of straw, with a bucket of sand and a pitchfork within reach. When the brothers approached at midnight, carrying oil-soaked rags, he dropped from the loft behind them, pitchfork leveled. One ran. Thomas pinned the other, a man named Corin, against the barn wall and demanded answers. Corin was a weasel, but a frightened one. Within 10 minutes, he had described Ferrick's instruction. Burn the barn, make it look like a lantern accident, and if the farmer died in the smoke, better. Corin had been paid in silver coin, newly minted with the Ferrick estate stamp. Thomas confiscated the coin as evidence. He brought Corin to Mara, who held a forging hammer and asked very few questions. Corin confessed again, naming Ferrick directly. Now they had a living witness, but the valley's power structure was Ferrick's own. The town council comprised men who owed him debts or feared his influence. A hired hand's word against a landowner's would not hold. They needed something irreversible, something that would force the community to see the truth before Ferrick could bury it. Thomas gathered the families of the 5 men whose relatives had confided suspicions. Leon brought Jareth's letter. Davin brought Mikel's journal. Alden's sister brought a torn coat he had been wearing when his horse spooked. The coat still carried the scent of ashroot, the same soaked into Thomas's rag. Perrin's cousin, a wheelwright, had kept the wagon axle that broke. It showed a saw cut identical to the barn beam. And Garen's son, a boy of 18, recalled that his father had argued with Ferrick the week before the barn collapse because Ferrick had insisted Garen owed a gambling debt he didn't owe. The pieces piled up. The pattern was no longer threadbare. It was a rope, but Ferrick was not blind to Thomas's movements. A spy in the market, a stable boy on his payroll, had reported the interviews. Ferrick decided that a subtle accident was no longer sufficient. He acted openly. The 4th attempt came in broad daylight. Thomas was walking home from the forge when Ferrick's personal enforcer, a brute named Hoskin, stepped out from a thicket with a weighted club. Hoskin was not there to scare. He was there to break bones, and Thomas, even with a knife, would have been overwhelmed if not for the intervention Thomas had arranged. He had anticipated Ferrick's escalation. He had asked Davin and 2 other families' sons to follow him at a distance, armed. When Hoskin lunged, they emerged from the trees with bows drawn. Hoskin froze. Thomas took the club and said, "Tell Ferrick I'm coming to his estate at sundown. I'm bringing every family he's wronged, and I'm bringing the truth." The words traveled back to Ferrick's manor. That afternoon, Thomas gathered the families. Not just the 5 who had evidence, all 8. He stood in the village square where the whispering had started years ago, and he spoke not to frighten, but to invite. He showed the lathe marks, the letters, the journal, the witness. He described the pattern. A curse didn't kill these men. A man did. And he's been waiting for his chance to kill again. You all believed Mara was the monster. But the monster built his house with your silence. The square was quiet. Then Leon, the widow, stepped forward. "I'll stand with you." One by one, the families agreed. The collective grief that had been scattered and buried was now aligning, a force that not even Ferrick could ignore. As the sun sank behind the mountain, Thomas led a procession of 18 people, widows, siblings, sons, daughters holding their father's final belongings, up the road to the Ferrick estate. The manor gate was iron, high, but the gatekeeper saw the crowd and the evidence in their hands and unlocked it. They found Ferrick on his veranda, a glass of whiskey in his hand, as if he had been waiting. His eyes were calm. He had stopped running. He had decided that the only way to bury this was to bury them all. Without raising his voice, Ferric said, "You've brought a parade to my home. I hope you've also brought an army, because I've sent for one." The torches of his hired men lit the tree line. Tomas and the families were surrounded. The crisis had just become a siege, and the man at the center of it all smiled, because he thought he had already won. The torches held steady. 10 men, maybe 12, rifles and cudgels, ringed the veranda where Ferric sat. The families stood frozen on the gravel, clutching letters and journals and a broken axle, outnumbered and outgunned. Tomas had marched them here expecting a confrontation. He had not expected an ambush. Ferric swirled his whiskey, the ice clinking like a punctuation mark. "You came to my home with paper and grief," he said. "I asked for an army, and I got one." "Did you?" For a long moment, only the wind answered, rattling the dry leaves. Then Tomas lifted his voice, not his hands. "You want an army, Ferric? Look behind you." The hired men turned, uncertain. On the ridge, a string of lanterns winked into being, 24 points of light. Then 36. The valley folk had not stayed home. Davin had circled up the mountain path with every able-bodied man from the northern passes. Trappers, woodcutters, farmers carrying axes and hunting bows. Not a paid militia. Just people who had lost brothers, husbands, sons, and were done losing. The torches that had enclosed the procession were now themselves enclosed. Ferric's smile did not vanish, but it lost its warmth. He shifted tactics. He set down his glass and spoke loudly, so all could hear. "You've assembled a mob, Ashdale, but a mob only has power if it has a crime to punish. What's my crime? Talking? Courting a woman years ago? Where is your proof that I killed anyone? You have a lathe mark that a dozen workshops could reproduce, a letter from a dead man who was known for paranoia, a frightened hired hand who'd say anything to save his own neck, a coat that might have brushed against any weed in the valley. You have coincidence dressed up as indictment, and when the county magistrate arrives, he's due within the hour, by the way, you'll be the ones answering for trespass, conspiracy, and incitement." He had planned this. Tomas saw it now. Ferric had known the families were gathering evidence, so he invited the final confrontation on his own ground, with the law already summoned to clean up the mess. And the magistrate, a man named Harlow, was deep in Ferric's debt. The estate had financed his re-election campaign. The families would be jailed, their testimony buried, and Tomas would be led away. Ferric would continue his reign, and Mara would remain isolated. But Tomas had planned, too. He had known that evidence alone wouldn't work. They needed a confession in the open, where even a bought magistrate couldn't ignore it. He had known Ferric would try to flip one of the families, and he had been waiting to see which one. At the back of the crowd, Perrin's cousin, the wheelwright who had kept the axle, shifted his feet. He had been silent since they arrived. Tomas had watched him, watched how he avoided eye contact, how he clutched the axle piece too tightly. Ferric's eyes found him, and the old man gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The wheelwright stepped forward. "The axle," he said, voice trembling. I might have been mistaken. The saw marks, they could be from a repair I did myself years ago. Tomas pressured me to say it was tampered. He wanted a story." A murmur rippled through the families. Leon's face crumpled. Davin's hand went to his knife. For a half-second, the coalition staggered. This was the pivot Ferric had bought. But Tomas didn't flinch. He walked over to the wheelwright, put a hand on his shoulder, and spoke softly enough that only the man and a few nearby could hear. I know you needed the silver. I know Ferric holds your loans, but I also know you loved Perrin. You don't want his name to go to the grave with a lie. So I'll give you one chance to be the man your cousin died believing you were. He held up the broken axle. This cut was fresh when Perrin died. You told me yourself, on the day of his funeral, that the wheel was sound the morning he left. You said, "Someone cut that axle, and I'll find out who." I'm asking you to finish that sentence. The wheelwright stared at the wood. His hands, calloused and strong, shook, and then he broke, not into a lie, but into a sob. He told me he'd take my shop, my boy's apprenticeship, everything. I'm sorry. He turned to the crowd. It was cut, fresh. I had nothing to do with it. Ferric's man Hoskin brought me the same wheel 2 weeks before, asking how to weaken the axle without leaving obvious marks. I thought it was a hypothetical. I swear on my life. The admission landed like a blow. Ferric's face didn't change, but the whiskey glass in his hand cracked. He had squeezed it. The families surged forward, and the hired men, now uncertain, edged back. The lanterns on the ridge began descending, Davin's people moving to link up. The magistrate's carriage could be heard on the distant road. Ferric saw his shield arriving, and he made one last play. "Hoskin," he said, "remove this slanderer from my property." Hoskin raised his club, but not at Thomas. He turned and faced Ferric. "I've done enough," he said. His voice, a low rumble, carried through the night. "I told myself I was just following orders. But a child waved at me once from a window. A girl who lost her father to your obsession. And I kept silent. Not tonight." He dropped the club. It clattered on the stone. The other hired men, one by one, lowered their weapons. The mercenary army Ferric had paid for had just voted with their feet. The magistrate's carriage clattered to a halt at the gate. Harlow, a dough-faced man with a notebook, stepped out and assessed the scene. The gathered families, the witnesses, the surrendered hired men, and Hoskin's testimony repeated loudly for all to hear. Ferric tried to speak, but Davin handed Harlow Mikul's journal, the damning entries marked. Lien gave him Jareth's letter. The wheelwright pointed to the axle and confessed his coercion by Ferric. The ashroot rag and the boat plug were passed forward. The proof was no longer circumstantial. It was a torrent. Then Mara arrived. She had not been idle. While Thomas gathered the families, she had taken Corin, the captured hired brother, and gone to Ferric's locked workshop. She had broken the door with her forging hammer. Inside she found the lathe, still bearing the double-line marking blade that matched every piece. But she also found a locked chest. Corin, terrified into cooperation, had led her to a loose stone in the wall where Ferric kept a personal journal. A small leather book, written in his own hand, cataloging every murder. Not with guilt, with pride. The dates, the methods, the little adjustments he made when an accident didn't work the first time. He had kept score of his own kills, as if they were trophies. Mara held the book aloft for the magistrate to see. Ferric saw it, and his composure finally shattered. He lunged for the book, screaming that it was a forgery. Thomas intercepted him, wrestled him back, and held him against the veranda rail, while the hired men, now cooperators, restrained him with rope. The families watched in silence. The man who had haunted their valley for 7 years was thrashing like a common criminal, his face purple, his empire of fear collapsing into the dirt. The magistrate had no choice. The journal alone was damning, but with the witnesses and the physical evidence, it was incontrovertible. He ordered Ferric bound for transport to the county seat, where a formal trial would be held. But everyone present knew there would be no acquittal. The lathe, the journal, the witnesses, they were an execution in slow motion. Ferric's power was broken. The curse was dead. But as they dragged him toward the carriage, Ferric looked back at Thomas, and his eyes, even in defeat, held a flicker of something not quite finished. He whispered something, too low for the others to hear, a single phrase meant only for Thomas. Thomas's face hardened. He didn't repeat it. But later, after the families had dispersed into the dawn, after Mara had wrapped her arms around him, he told her what Ferric had said. "You think I'm the only one who wanted her alone. Ask yourself who else fed the curse." It was a thread left dangling, a door not quite closed, a fear that the valley's sickness ran deeper than one man. And so, even as the sun rose on a community freed from a ghost, Thomas and Mara knew the real battle, the one to ensure no shadow ever fell on their life together again, was only beginning. The sun rose on a valley that looked the same pines, the same crooked fence lines, the same smoke curling from chimneys. But no one who walked the roads that morning felt the same. Ferric's carriage had rolled out before dawn, taking him to the county seat in chains, his journal locked in the magistrate's evidence box. Thomas stood with Mara on the veranda where, hours earlier, the old tyrant had sipped whiskey and believed himself untouchable. Now the only sound was the clink of broken glass being swept away by Ferric's former housekeeper, a stern woman who spat on the floor before scrubbing it. "He said someone else fed the curse," Mara said, turning Ferric's whispered words over. "He wasn't lying. Lying took effort. That was a gift. He wanted us to tear each other apart, hunting shadows, to prove that even after he was gone, we'd never rest." Thomas nodded. He had seen the look on Ferric's face. Not defeat, a legacy of distrust. The man had planted a splinter, and if they didn't find it and pull it out, it would fester. So they started not with a mob, but with a map. Thomas unfolded Ferric's journal on the blackened anvil in Mara's forge. They read together by the rekindled coals. The journal detailed 8 murders, yes, but also margins crammed with notes. Payments to the late sheriff's deputy, who had declared each death accidental without investigation. A weekly stipend to a village gossip named Myrta, who had whispered fresh rumors every time a new suitor appeared. A loan forgiven to the county magistrate Harlow for future considerations. The curl of fear hadn't sprung from one man alone. It had been watered by collaborators who flourished in his shadow. Mara traced a name. Myrta. The woman still lived above the Stillwater Bakery, dispensing malice like communion wafers. She told my mother, 20 years ago, that a half-orc child would bring a blight on the valley. My mother died believing it. Mara's voice was steady, but her hand clenched. I never knew who started that. Now I do. The reckoning with the co-conspirators was quieter than the confrontation with Ferric, but no less thorough. Thomas and Mara didn't go alone. They went with Davin and Leon, with the wheelwright who had reclaimed his honor, with Hoskin, who had thrown his club away, and now walked with the stiff shoulders of a man learning to stand without armor. They visited the deputy first, a retired man named Corley, who kept a small orchard. When they presented Ferric's payment logs, Corley didn't argue. He broke like dry wood, weeping into his apple tree's bark, swearing he'd only taken the money because he was afraid to cross Ferric. They left him to his conscience after he signed a sworn statement. Myrta was harder. She refused to open her door, shrieking from the window that Thomas was a devil and Mara was his monster. But the baker, whose own brother had been one of the suitors, demanded she be stopped. The town council, now terrified of the family's collective power, revoked her lease. She left the valley within a week, her bags light, her legacy of poison heavier than anything she carried. The magistrate Harlow proved the most entrenched. He arrived back in the valley 3 days later, attempting to hold a hearing that would minimize Ferrick's crimes to preserve his own reputation. But the families packed the meeting hall, and Thomas read aloud from the journal, the entry detailing Harlow's forgiven loan. The room went deathly silent. Harlow's gavel shook. By sunset, he had resigned his post, and the county seat appointed an interim magistrate who owed nothing to anyone in Thornwood. The last structural pillar of the curse crumbled. Only then, with the hidden architects unmasked, did Thomas ask the question that had started it all. They stood in the forge, surrounded by iron and fire, and the scent of a future no longer forbidden. "Mara, I came to you because I was half dead from loneliness. But I stayed because you are not what they said. And I am asking you to be my wife, not because I want to be the first to survive, but because I want to be the first to live with you." Mara set down her forging hammer. She had refused a suitor once, with a thrown hammer and a curse of her own. This time, her amber eyes held no armor. "Yes," she said, "but if you ever call me the Orc in your vows, I'll throw another hammer." Thomas laughed, the first easy laugh he had managed in years. "I'll practice the right words." The wedding was held in the town square, not at dawn or midnight like a secret, but under a clear noon sky. The families of the 8 dead suitors formed an honor guard, each holding something that belonged to their lost man: a woodcutter's axe, a tailor's shears, a trapper's pelt, as if to say, "They are not forgotten, and they stand with us now." The new magistrate performed the ceremony. He spoke of resurrection, not of curses. Thomas, dressed in a clean but unpretentious shirt, held Mara's hands, green and rough, and said his vows without hesitation. Mara, her tusks polished but unfiled, spoke hers with a voice that carried to every corner of the square. When the magistrate pronounced them wed, a roar went up, not from paid soldiers, but from ordinary people who had finally learned the difference between a monster and a man. The valley's transformation wasn't overnight, but it began that day. Farmers who had avoided Mara's forge for years brought her their broken plows to repair, knowing she would work with more skill than anyone in the region. Mothers, who had once pulled their children aside when she passed, now asked her to teach their sons the basics of metalwork. Thomas's farm, once leaning and listless, expanded. Mara moved her forge from the edge of the valley to a new workshop beside the barn, with a window that faced the sun. The gray pause Thomas had inhabited for so long lifted. The fields thrived. So did they. And then, on an evening 6 months after the wedding, a detail emerged that recast everything. Thomas was clearing the old root cellar beneath Ferrick's abandoned estate. The families had decided to turn it into a grain storehouse for the poor, when he found a false stone in the wall. Behind it lay a lockbox with more of Ferrick's papers, early letters dating back 7 years, written not by him, but to him. They were anonymous, unsigned, in a careful script that mimicked a woman's hand, but was clearly forged. The letters had detailed Mara's daily movements, her forge routine, and, crucially, had suggested the first accident. They had planted the idea of killing her suitors, framing it as a service to the valley. Ferrick, already obsessed, had taken the suggestion and run with it, but the seed had come from someone who knew the valley even better than he did. Thomas brought the letters to Mara. She studied the handwriting, the syntax, the watermarks. And then a memory clicked. It was the same stationery used by Myrta, the gossip, years ago when she had sent anonymous notes to Mara's mother. Myrta hadn't just spread rumors. She had been the unseen hand behind the very first murder, baiting Ferric into becoming her weapon. She had wanted Mara destroyed from the start, not because of a curse, but because Mara's existence, as a half-orc woman of strength and independence, shattered the world Myrta thought ought to be. This revelation, quiet and late, didn't undo the healing, but it deepened Tomas's understanding. Evil didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered through ink, hiding behind a grandmother's smile. Myrta was already gone from the valley, her power broken. But the discovery meant that the circle of blame was finally complete. There would be no more hidden conspirators, no more loose whispers. The sickness had been fully excised. 1 year to the day after Thomas first walked into the forge, the valley held a festival. Not to celebrate Ferric's downfall, that was old news, but to mark the first year of Thomas and Mara's union, which the families had come to call the living year. 8 candles were lit for the 8 suitors who never became husbands, and then a 9th candle, larger than the rest, for the man who had broken the curse not by being invincible, but by refusing to let fear write the ending. Mara, her belly just beginning to round with a child, stood beside Tomas and blew out the 9th candle with a single breath of her forge-tender lungs. The crowd cheered, and for the first time in 7 years, a mention of Mara's name in public carried only joy. That night, on the porch of their restored farmhouse, Tomas looked out over the dark valley and said, "I told them I'd be the first man to survive marrying you. I was wrong. I didn't just survive. I woke up." Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You were the first to see me. That's all I ever needed." And in the silence that followed, the wind moved through the pines without a whisper of shame, and the valley, at last, was whole. What Thomas and Mara built in Thornwood was more than a marriage. It was a verdict. A verdict against the idea that some people are too different to love, too cursed to touch, too dangerous to trust. The curse that claimed 8 lives was never supernatural. It was human, crafted from obsession, enabled by silence, and paid for in blood. But Tomas didn't just survive it. He dismantled its architecture. With Mara, he exposed that the real monsters were not the ones people whispered about, but the ones who hid their crimes behind those whispers. Ferric was the obvious villain, the jealous tyrant who turned rejection into a 7-year killing spree. But the story went deeper. Myrta, the pious gossip who planted the first suggestions of murder, was the shadow behind the curtain. The deputy who filed false reports, the magistrate who traded influence for loans, the villagers who pulled their children away from a blacksmith's forge. They were the mortar that held the curse together. When Tomas refused to believe the story, he didn't just save himself. He forced an entire community to look at the scaffolding of its own prejudice and tear it down. And that took more than courage. It took the willingness to go back to every family, to listen to their grief, and to say, "You were lied to, but you can still be part of the truth." That's the part of the story that lingers. It's easy to see a monster and fight him. It's much harder to see how you might have fed the monster without knowing. The valley could have rejected Thomas the same way it rejected every suitor before. But when he stood in the square and asked the families to look at the evidence, they chose a different path. They chose to believe a half-orc woman they had shunned for years. And that choice, to believe, was what finally starved the curse of its power. So here's the question that stays. How many other Maras are still living at the edge of someone's valley, waiting for a single person to stop believing in ghosts? How many curses are just cloaks, worn by those who know that fear will keep everyone from looking too closely? The Thornwood curse ended not with a sword, but with a man who asked to see the lathe marks for himself, and then showed them to everyone else. If this story of resilience and reckoning struck a chord, you can be part of this community by subscribing. Hit that button so you never miss a deep dive into tales where the real monsters aren't the ones we're warned about. They're the ones doing the warning. Tell us in the comments, what was the moment when you realized the curse wasn't real? Was it the lathe marks, the journal, or something else entirely? And if you know someone who needs to hear that love is stronger than every whisper thrown at it, share this video with them. We'll be back with more stories that prove the bravest thing you can do is knock on a door everyone else is too afraid to approach.